Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Danny, and I'm the program coordinator for Knowledge Box. This evening, we'll be touching on the topic, setting up an investment. To start us off, we'll have our Knowledge Box speaker, Nate Howlett, go ahead and touch on the psychology of success once again. Who knows exactly what he has in stores for us today, so I'm excited to see what kind of things he got for our mindset to get us warmed up. And then upon the conclusion of that presentation, we'll go ahead and I'll pass over to Philippe from Kwajamii, or I may be pronouncing that correctly. He'll correct me when we get to that portion of the presentation. And we'll get into the setting up an investment, and then we'll close out with a Q&A if there's any questions. So, okay, without further ado, let's go ahead and pass it over to Nate.
Thank you, Danny. I appreciate that. And good evening, everybody. It's 6 o'clock, so I'm going to call it evening, and I'm going to boot up my presentation here. Yeah, so we've done this segment a few times now. This is the fourth segment that I've hosted, Psychology of Success. And I really do think that it's a nice intro, because I think it helps us to curate the way that we're thinking about our own lives, to try and find pathways that work to accomplish financial success, which is really what we're hoping to do with this entire program, is to provision young people, especially to be financially successful in their future. And how do you do that? We don't think that that's very well presented or curated in high school, certainly in Ontario, but probably broadly. It's a lot of people there, and just they don't really understand exactly what it takes to advance their financial position forward, other than following a program that was designed by people who also didn't run businesses or whatnot. So how do you make your way forward in the world? And so that's the genesis of the Psychology of Success segment. And I don't love the title, but the subtitle here is Manufacturing Meaning. But I do want to talk about what meaning is on a fundamental level, and then how we can use that to, again, propel us forward in our own lives in various ways. In terms of recap, again, I like to go over what we talked about in the past. So the first session we talked about was something called learned helplessness. And again, the idea there was some psychological experiments that we don't need to get into, but the idea is that, if you don't really think that you're going to be successful at a certain task, whether that be something as mundane as, taking out the garbage, or it could be, a sport. Maybe you think you're terrible at basketball, or maybe you think you're terrible at math or writing or something. And so why bother trying, right? So we don't have infinite capacity as individuals, but we have some amount of capacity which we can choose to limit. And if you do so by deciding that, I can't do X, Y, or Z, then you're limiting your human potential. And so there's this phenomenon called learned helplessness, where we just decide, we can't succeed, we can't move forward. And there are a lot of people right now who are frankly making a lot of money telling young people from disadvantaged backgrounds that they can't succeed. And that's terrible psychologically, because why bother? If you can't succeed because the system is irrevocably against you, why would you bother even try? And so learned helplessness is this phenomenon where we choose to believe a certain, limitation, let's say, and therefore we don't bother exerting an effort to accomplish something. So it's a really challenging dynamic to overcome. The second session, we talked about treating your personal finances like a business, which, part of that involves just planning. So that's building projections down here. So, okay, what are my incomes, what are my expenses? How can I manage those the way that a business owner might choose to manage their own affairs? And also overcoming certain cognitive biases and mental siloing, as we talked about, which, again, that's taking your expenses and saying, okay, we got this amount of money that's for this category, and this amount of money that's for another category, and never shall the twain meet. But the idea here is that, it's all a big picture about advancing your financial position. And so we shouldn't account for things so carefully that we only have $50 for spending money and $100 for transit and $200 for something else. We should look at it as a larger picture and say, okay, we can reallocate strategically to advance our positions the way that, again, a business owner would treat their finances. So you want to treat your personal finances like a business owner would treat theirs. And then the third session, we talked about investing in your human capital. And human capital in some very raw form is the ability for you to generate wealth or accrue income over the course of your life. And so, okay, there are people who can make more or less money over time. And, why is that? Why is one person able to create more wealth or generate more income and someone else, less able to do so? And the take home that I wanted to impart for people on that point was, at the end of the day, yes, there are perversions. You can take advantage of people. You can be a nasty criminal, sure. But, typically speaking, in our societies, the way that we generate more capital or income or wealth is becoming very useful to the people who are around us. And if we're able to do that, then it turns out that if you've got something really useful to somebody else, they're going to pay you to deliver that useful outcome, service, good, whatever it may be. And so investing in your own human capital is considering, okay, how can I become a more productive, useful person to the people around me and thereby capitalize on those human capacities that I have? And so that's a bit of a recap. And today I want to talk about manufacturing meaning. I don't really like manufacturing, but it was alliterative, so maybe it's easier to remember. But discovering meaning could be a better way to think about it, because we can't just manufacture a sense of meaning, but we can probably orient ourselves toward experiences that would produce meaning in our lives. So this is meant to be sort of just a spitball type question, but if everyone could think about a meaningful experience or a favorite story or movie that they have in their experience that they have.
If anyone has any meaningful experiences or favorite stories, feel free to throw into a chat. I have one I'd like to throw in there, Nate.
Please do.
The Alchemist. It's one of my favorite quick short novels. All about creating and going on one's path.
Why is it your favorite story? Why is it one of your favorite stories, I guess?
Oh, okay, why? Okay, so the reason why is one of my favorite stories because it when I first read it, it just reminded me about the importance of paying attention to the signs around you, and to be sometimes to be quiet and still in order to be attentive to those signs, and in order to continue to do things that you have within your own control, because the Alchemist is all about kind of creating something out of nothing. And when it comes to whether it's a business or anything that you want to create, it starts with an idea, right? So that's what the Alchemist is all about, starting with this idea in your spirit and your being, and then bringing it to fruition. That's pretty much what the story of the Alchemist is about. So
cool. Yeah, no, I have to look that up actually. I've never read or listened to that story, but it sounds really cool. And so, yeah, so the reason I would ask, Danny, why, like what makes it one of his favorite stories or movies? And again, it's highlighting these ideas where you're bringing something into fruition out of nothing. It's a powerful idea, right? And also being quiet and attentive to what's going on around you. That's a very important lesson in wisdom, I suppose. How might I engage with the world around me? And part of that would be, being still and considering what's happening, making inferences from that so that the next time you encounter the same problem or opportunity that you navigate it more effectively, right? So that's a really interesting, diagnosis of the story. Like I said, I'll have to read it more, but, for me, and again, I'm going to try and tie in a bit about Danny's analysis there, but again, just one that came up for me was, I love the film Jurassic Park. It's one of my favorite movies. And a big part of that's probably nostalgia. I was 6 years old when it came out, and then I've watched it soon after, and it's always been part of my childhood. But, I think about the things that made it really impressive as a film. Cinematic innovation. There's that moment at the beginning of the film, pretty close to the beginning, where they first encounter the dinosaurs. And John Williams is the composer of the soundtrack. It's like, it's a very moving soundtrack. And then the CGI animation, it was one of the first times it was done at that level. Incredible. And these dinosaurs really looked real, very powerful moving moment in that film. but it posed important moral questions. Specifically, you know, what are the limits of scientific exploit? Like where do we draw the line and say, you know, we want to explore as much as we can as a species, but recreating dinosaurs in the modern context, what happens is very catastrophic. And so it's a cautionary tale about going too far with science, right? So there's an important moral question at work. And then there's heroics, right? It's a life and death situation that some people make it out of and some don't, right? And there are heroic figures at play in this film, and dinosaurs, which, you know, of course we all love. So I love Jurassic Park, and there's a number of reasons why, but these are some important facets that I want to bring up to structure, again, the next piece of the conversation, which is like, what is meaning? What does it mean to have that experience where you're being perhaps challenged, but it's more, again, a sentiment in a moment. It's like a very meaningful moment. What is that? And where does it come from? And how might you pursue that with more intentionality? So I want to talk about two ideas, order and chaos. And order, again, these aren't terribly complex terms, but order is the things that we know, we understand, you've got categorized. This is the stuff that we got down pat, right? So that's order in your life. And then chaos is the stuff that's unknown, unfamiliar, foreign. My favorite example is if something is, you know, there could be a film that you watch and love, but if it's expressed in a foreign language, you're going to miss all the dialogue, right? And it's not that you don't know the film, it's not that you don't care for it, it's that it's being expressed in a language that you don't understand. And that's too much chaos, right? You cannot understand what's going on because the chaos is swirling around you. You don't know what the words mean. Order is the language, your mother tongue or other languages that you might know. And when words are expressed in that language, some of which you might not know even, but generally speaking, you can follow along with what's going on because there's enough order in that moment that you can navigate space. So order and chaos are these general terms here that I want to highlight. And so I just put this pictographic together. It's very basic, but you know, order is a subset of, let's say, chaos, which is possibility. So chaos is that large oval there. It's the things that might be or that are, and I don't understand them. It's just that potentiality. It's very poorly defined by definition, right? And order is the stuff that from a very young age, I started to put together, right? Like, you know, I walk on, or I drive on the right-hand side of the street because the society I live in, that's the norm, right? That's not the case across the world, but, you know, in general, we have a sense of order. We say, okay, well, this is what we do in our society. And we establish, you know, again, linguistics, all these kinds of ways of navigating the world so that we can avoid, you know, premature death, for example, which sounds awful, but, you know, you don't want to walk on the wrong side of the street because you can run into a car, right? And so we learn these things very quickly from a very young age. And we establish order because it does protect us and helps us to communicate or whatever else we're trying to do and navigate the world is a better way to think of it. So order, it starts very small at a core. It's something like an acorn, and then that will grow gradually over your life as you begin to order the chaos into something you can understand. Meaning is that moment where the things that you understand, the order in your life, expand somewhat into the chaos, into the things that you don't understand, things that you've never appreciated for what they are, either by lack of exposure or by incoherence, whatever it is. But the order expanding where you take a little bit of that chaos and then you map it into what you understand in terms of the order of your life and the things that you've experienced, that expansion is a moment of meaning. There's a connection between the unknown and the known where you grow in your knowledge and capacity. And that's a very real experience. And that's why I ask about great works of fiction, like Danny brought up again, talking about The Alchemist. There's something about that story that's helping Danny to navigate the world around him in a way that he hadn't considered before he read that book. And that book gave him some insight into the way that the world works. And so he was able to expand his sense of order into chaos. And he really loves the book because it produced this feeling of this sense of meaningfulness. Like what I'm doing right now is very meaningful. And I think it's actually probably the most fundamental human experience that we go through as we navigate the world around us. So today, really what I'm trying to say is, okay, this experience of being in a meaningful moment is extremely powerful and motivating. And what I want to encourage people to think about is, how can we more regularly encounter that in our own day-to-day lives? And so how do you manufacture meaning? It's not manufactured. How do you discover it? You have to experience it. It's something that just happens. It's not something that you can force, I don't think. But there are different ways to pursue it. So one thing would be challenging presuppositions. And the way that I do this in my own life is I think about philosophy or ethics. And one thing, again, if we wanted to talk about is the concept of free will, for example, which is something that a lot of people presuppose. We just assume that, we have this experience called free will. But what is free will? Where does it come from? How does it function? All these sorts of questions. You can challenge that and think, even in your own mind. You don't have to read, you don't have to talk to anybody. You can just think carefully to yourself, okay, well, what are these things? And have a moment of meaning in your own, bedroom while you're drifting off to sleep, challenging presuppositions about what you assumed was true. You may not really know, you just assumed it. You can assume responsibility. This is a big one, right? Where you take, again, ownership for your own existence or for other people's existence in your family, community, school, wherever you are. Assuming responsibility for, I think, almost everyone is a huge source of that sense of meaning. So people become mothers and fathers. You have a kid. It's not just, and maybe there's an evolutionary impulse where you're propagating the species, whatever. But individuals do it because I think it's very meaningful to father or mother a child, right? There's something there that gives your life a sense of purpose. And that's, again, one of the most meaningful things I think a person can go through is having a family. Persevering through adversity. This is a big one. I said, be the hero in your own story. And tragedy is probably the human constant. If there's one thing that brings us all together, it's the fact that existence is brutal at times, if not regularly. And so you have a choice of what you're going to do with the difficulty of existence. And you can choose to, basically, you can be a victim or you can be a hero, right? And so my encouragement here is to, I'm not saying that, difficulties they can definitely overwhelm you, but you do have a choice of what you're going to do in response to that. I would encourage people to persevere and become the hero through the adversity that exists in their lives, because it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere, you can't avoid it. And so if you have a choice, I'd encourage you to persevere and be that hero. And I think that can be very meaningful as well, because we all suffer, we all do. Pursue noble goals, right? And so part of what we're doing here today, Philippe, myself, Danny, maybe Danny's getting paid, I don't know, but I'm not getting paid. I'm just literally here because I have an interest in trying to help young people orient themselves in the world to be able to, to be socially mobile, to accomplish the things that they want to do, to feel like they've got a way forward, and that's what I care about. And I think that we all have the opportunity to help people who are worse off than we are. So I'd encourage people to consider how they might pursue noble goals in their own lives. And that's another way to pursue meaning. Self-directed learning. So, the people in the audience who are in high school, which is, again, part of our target demographic, a lot of the learning you're doing is not self-directed. It is something that someone else has dialed in for you, whether that be the Ontario Ministry of Education or someone else. Self-directed learning is really powerful because it's you following your own interests. And the story I'll give you is, I've done a bit of musical education over my life, and I started playing piano, which was something that my parents put me into at a young age. But the stuff that I was taught by my teachers was not music that I was interested in at all. And so, you kind of plug away, you do a little bit of work, but I never really committed time and effort to becoming competent at the piano. And then at about 15, 16, I picked up the guitar, and I love classic rock. And, I just played whatever songs I wanted to and really enjoyed the process of learning music that I cared about and got really good at it. And I spent, in grade 12, just because of the way my schedule worked, I had 3 or 4 hours a day in school where I just played guitar. And I got really good at guitar because I spent 5 months, 4 hours a day, 5 days a week playing, and I followed the interest that really motivated me. And I became very good at guitar because I was doing something that was, again, self-directed learning. And so for me, that was a very, again, meaningful experience. You know, it takes time, it's not immediate, but it's a way that I can follow my own interests to develop, you know, a passion where I can produce something good in the world that inspires people. And again, music is something that's very deeply meaningful for a lot of us. Whatever that means for you, this kind of self-directed learning, it motivates itself because it is indeed self-directed. It's the things that you're passionate about. So I'd encourage you to pursue those as well in, again, trying to establish meaning in your life. And then in a very general sense, I would encourage people to seek new experiences, especially ones that inspire beauty and awe. So new experiences will always challenge you. They always push out your sense of what you understand in terms of order into the chaos just a little bit. It could be language, it could be cultural differences, I don't know what, but travel, I think, does challenge that preconception that you might have about what the world is supposed to be, and what is possible. But yeah, if you find yourself in nature or an artistic endeavor, and I'm terrible at art and painting, but some people love that and they're able to express themselves very succinctly, and the depth of their soul can be manifested. So I would encourage people who want to do that kind of work as well to absolutely do it. These are the things that will, they will produce an expression of who you are on a fundamental level and help you to, again, find that meaning that does sustain us in life and helps to orient. So there's two things, again, that I want to leave with. One is that meaning does actually help you to persevere. Again, I got that on the list, persevere through adversity. If you have a sense of purpose, you know, for whatever you're going through, that helps you to sustain yourself through it. But more importantly, in today's discussion, again, talking about personal finance, what I want to encourage people to do is think about meaning and finding it as a way to orient yourself through your life. So these moments where you're, again, learning and growing and assuming responsibility, pursuing noble goals, all these things will help you to find your way through the chaos that is life. You just don't know what it's going to throw at you. But these sorts of things will help you to, again, find your sense of self-purpose, meaning as you go through the challenges that you're going to go through, because you don't get an out on that. But yeah, so hopefully that gives you a bit of guidance as far as where we might want to, on an individual level, orient ourselves.
Thank you so much, Nate. Let's give him a round of applause. I'm gonna give you a round of applause for that. It's beautiful, beautiful. If you have any comments, any questions, feel free to throw those in the chat. You could also send in a direct message to me as well. Nate will probably going to stand by with us for this presentation, so you can also throw those in, and we can take those questions at the end of the session. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Philippe, our main speaker of this evening. He's going to be touching on setting up an investment. So I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to him now.
So let me go back. So 3 accounts: the RSP I just talked about, the tax-free savings account, which is the TFSA, has been around for some time, since 2009. And then finally, the non-registered account. So what are the characteristics of those 3 accounts? So if we start with the RSP, it's an individual account. It's an account that is registered with CRA, and it's an account that has a maximum amount that you can contribute to over a given period of time. And the maximum annual contribution is determined by Canada Revenue Agency. It's also contributions made to the RSP will reduce your income taxes for the year. Another characteristics is the unused contribution. The good news, unused contribution room would carry over to the next year. So let's say that I have $10,000 worth of RSP room this year, and I don't make any contributions to my RSP account this year, then those $10,000 worth of contribution room would not be lost. It will actually carry over to 2023. The RSP account is also known as a tax-deferred account. So what does that mean? Really, that means that no taxes are owed on any investment income, whether we talk about interest income or dividend income or realized capital gains. Another characteristics of the RSP account is the funds that you would withdraw are considered taxable income. So you can withdraw at any point in time, but if you do, then the funds would be added to your income for the year and therefore would be taxed at your marginal tax rate. Last but not least, one important actually feature of the RSP is that your RSP account must be converted to a RIF account, which is a registered retirement income fund, in the year that you turn 71. So let's say that I'm going to be 71 in November. That means that I have up to December 31st to have my RSP converted to a RIF account. So those are the broad characteristics of the RSP account. There are a few more, but I think that will provide the basic actually. The next account that I would like to talk about is the tax-free savings account, or TFSA. This is also an individual account that is registered with Canada Revenue Agency. Like the RSP, there is a maximum annual contribution room that is provided by CRA. Unused contributions, just like the RSP, can carry forward. Contributions made to the RSP, unlike what we had for the RSP, contributions made to the tax-free savings account are after-tax contributions. So you have to pay your taxes first, and then you can actually make the TFSA contributions. The TFSA is known also as a tax-exempt account, and this is one of the greatest, I would argue, characteristic of the TFSA, is that no taxes are owed on any investment income made within the TFSA account, whether we talk about interest, dividend, or capital gains. Amount can be withdrawn from a TFSA at any point in time. Those amounts would not be subject to taxes. However, if you wanted to recontribute the amount withdrawn back to the TFSA, you have to be extremely, extremely careful. And I will explain this actually. Let's say that I have invested in my TFSA account for many, many years, and I now have $50,000 in my TFSA account. Let's assume now that I am actually withdrawing $30,000 from my TFSA for, I don't know, let's say I need a car, I wanted actually to buy a car. Now, if I only have $10,000 worth of TFSA contribution room for 2022, and I just made that withdrawal, then I will not be able to contribute. Let's say that I no longer want to buy this car, and I change my mind and I want to put the money back into the TFSA, then I will not be able to recontribute the full amount of $30,000 because I only can contribute $10,000 in 2022. The good news is that if I wait for the next calendar year, for sure, the amount withdrawn will be added to my overall contribution room, and therefore at that point, I will be able to recontribute the entire amount. Something to be careful about, because any over contribution, there will be a penalty and there will be a tax applied to this, and it's quite actually substantial. So something to think about. Yeah. Now, the non-registered account is the third most commonly used type of account in Canada. I use the example of a cash account, which is an individual or a joint account, could be a joint account as well. There are no limits on contribution. Taxes are owed annually on any investment income. So whether we talk about interest, dividend, or realized capital gains, taxes will have to be paid on those gains made during the year. And there are no taxes on the funds that you would withdraw from a cash account. So pretty simple, but you see there are very distinct tax attributes between all three types of accounts. And this will have its importance a little bit later in the presentation. The opening process, really, it's fairly simple. There are really, in my mind, three phases. We actually have to submit something called a new account application form, or NAF. We also need to submit supplementary forms, and we'll go through the details a little bit in a moment. And then the third phase is once the account is open finally and up and running, then it's a matter of funding your account before you are in a position to invest your funds. So let's go through all three phases. This is a little bit small perhaps, but I will talk to each of those 3 points here. On the new account application form, what type of information do you have to provide? Obviously, the type of account that you want to open, you need to provide your full name, date of birth, you need to provide your citizenship, your social insurance number, and so on and so forth. Also, your contact information, so address, email, preferred method to be contacted. Your occupation is also required on the form, your employer's name, the income, approximately your net worth, which is your assets minus your liabilities, and that would include both financial and non-financial assets. Also, all the regulatory information, whether or not you are a politically exposed person, which is PEP, account purpose. So what do you intend to use this account for? It could be for retirement. It could be for, setting funds aside to purchase a property down the road, for all kinds of reasons, but you have to specify the reason. The source of your funds, of course, typically it would come from personal savings, but not always. It could be inheritance or anything, but you have to specify the source of funds. Also, you need to designate a beneficiary. God forbid something were to happen to you. It would be wise to actually have a beneficiary designated. Photo ID, of course, banking information with the information provided on a void check, for example, and of course the signature. Supplementary forms might at times be required depending on the type of account that you are opening. So for instance, if you were to open a TFSA account, there might be one additional form that you would need to provide. Same thing goes for our ESP, the Registered Education Savings Plan, of course. But there is also a third form that we need to provide, is called the W-8 form. This is a US form. This is really for US people, although everyone has to fill in that form, but it's really meant to identify US people who would have to also pay taxes in the US. The US is one of those countries where it doesn't just tax, it does not just tax your income generated in the US, but rather your worldwide income. And therefore, this is mandatory actually from the US government. Then the third phase, once the account is up and running, funding your account. So there are different ways that you can use to fund your account. Either you had a similar account elsewhere and you want to actually just transfer your existing assets into your newly opened account. So for instance, if you had an RSP somewhere else and you want to consolidate everything, all your registered assets into this newly opened RSP, then you would actually operate a direct transfer from your existing RSP to this newly opened RSP. That's one way. Another way would be to make a one-time deposit, electronic fund transfer, EFT transfer, to this newly opened account. Another way would be to set up a pre-authorized contribution. So let's say that every month you might want to, or might decide to deposit $200 or so every month. And of course, the signature is also required on all those forms. So now that you have an account, what type of investment approaches are available for you? Three main approaches that I would like to touch upon: active investing, passive investing, and goal-based investing. The first one is active investing. So if I am an active manager, what I say is that I can generate above market returns on a risk-adjusted basis. So that means that I promise you, as an investor, I promise you to deliver a better rate of return than the one that you would actually generate by just purchasing all the stocks on the Toronto Stock Exchange, for example. This involves forecasting and stock picking. So essentially how that works is that I would do some analysis, and if my price that I forecast for, let's say, a year from now is higher than the current price of the stock, then I would actually purchase that stock, of course. And if I estimate that the price is going to be lower next year, then I would tend actually to sell that stock. So this is what an active manager would tend to do. Usually, it's more expensive than index investing that we'll see in a moment, simply because an active manager would tend to charge higher management fees. It also leads to more concentrated portfolio, between 20 and 60, I said on the slide, sometimes maybe 80. But it's certainly not all the stocks available on the Toronto Stock Exchange. For example, if we were to look at the Canadian market, there are about 250 stocks on the Toronto Stock Exchange also. This active investing approach also leads to a higher risk level compared to that of the overall market. So that's something to keep in mind. And I would argue that it's easier said than done. This idea of forecasting, and we know how difficult it is to forecast. The best analogy that I have is I don't think anyone, certainly not Environment Canada, had predicted the cold weather that we had so far in January. In fact, if I go back to their forecast a couple of months or 3 months ago, it was calling for a milder, especially in the east, winter. So clearly forecasting is one of the most difficult exercise for humans out there. Now, index investing seeks, on the other hand, to achieve market returns, no more, no less. Involves buying entire section of the market through the use of index funds or ETF, exchange traded funds. And this is a very practical solution, particularly for smaller portfolios. Easier and faster to achieve full diversification, because if you were to purchase an ETF that represents the Toronto Stock Exchange, for example, in one purchase, it's as if you would have purchased all 250 stocks on the Toronto Stock Exchange. So that practical aspect is absolutely critical, especially if you have a smaller portfolio. But having said this, it also works very well with larger portfolios. It's very cost effective, just like I mentioned, one purchase as opposed to 250 individual purchases, usually a much cheaper approach than active investing. Finally, I would like to say a few words about goal-based investing. Goal-based investing involves building, just like the name indicates, a separate and dedicated portfolio for each goal. And this is very important because we all have different goals and aspirations in life. Some of those goals would have a shorter time horizon, while others would have a much longer time horizon. Let's say I want to save to buy, let's say, a home in a few years, then that would have a very different time horizon if I were to think about my retirement portfolio, which is 30-year plus time years away. So that makes a huge difference and helps actually manage all the goals, even those with conflicting time horizons. It's also much better to allow you to track the progress that you make towards each of your goals. The progress towards each goal could be actually measured very, very precisely. Moving on to what I call today smart investing, which is my investment belief, my investment philosophy, an investment philosophy that I strongly believe will benefit most investors, if not all investors, really. There are three phases actually when it comes to smart investing. The first one is financial planning. I would argue that you don't really want to invest, not even perhaps 1 cent, unless you have actually built prior to investing an investment plan. Then the second phase is once the plan obviously is done, then comes the time to implement that plan and build your portfolio. And then the third phase is monitoring and regularly reviews of your portfolio. Let's jump into this for more details. So what is smart investing and what's its purpose? Well, it seeks to maximize the investor's probability of success, which is really the probability of achieving your goals. This approach also focuses on what is under our control. Unlike active investing, where we seek higher rate of return, it's not so much the case with smart investing, because we adopt an index approach to investing and a goal-based approach to investing. So in terms of rate of return, we simply accept what the market will generate. But we tend to focus on the things that we can actually control. So what can we control? Well, we can control the investment time horizon. I could decide to purchase my house in 2 years as opposed to 3, or delayed my purchase to 4 years as opposed to 3. I control also the risk level that I want to have embedded in my portfolio. I do control something very important. It's called tax efficiency. I'll come back to this in a moment. We also control how much fees I pay. I don't have to actually pursue the most expensive solution, so on, so on and so forth. So there are many, many parameters that we do not control, such as rate of return I mentioned. And well, the Bank of Canada actually decided to hold interest rates actually steady today, not something that as an investor I have control over, the bank does, and so on and so forth. All right, so what does that mean practically for an investor? Well, you always want to start with a financial plan. And once you have your financial plan, just like I mentioned earlier, comes the time to implement that plan. And it always maintaining a well-diversified portfolio, always maintaining an appropriate asset mix in all circumstances. The asset mix is really how much do I want to hold in stocks and how much do I want to hold in bonds. And as you get closer and closer to your goal, like let's say that I am 6 months away from retirement, maybe it would not be wise for me to maintain a super heavy exposure to the stock market because of volatility. So that is something that is important, is to slowly reduce the level of risk that you have in your portfolio as you get closer and closer to your goals. Apply asset allocation techniques. So I mentioned earlier 3 primary accounts that are commonly used in Canada, and I will, for the sake of this argument, mention only 2, the RSP and the TFSA. What you also want to achieve is maximum tax efficiency for your portfolio. So what does that mean? That means that you are worried about your after-tax return. And you remember perhaps the TFSA and the RSP have very, very distinct tax attributes. The TFSA, no taxes on investment income. So if you had the choice, to place and locate your most promising assets, the one that you expect to have the highest gains, where would you put actually that investment? Well, you would probably want to put it into your TFSA because the gains would not be taxed. And so tax location is this technique that allows you to carefully choose what assets you want to actually place in what account. Very, very important aspect. Also, as part of smart investing, you want to rebalance your portfolio. So let's say that you wanted to maintain 70% of your portfolio towards the stock market. And the stock market, just like it did last year, for example, did very well. You may end up at 75 or 80% of your portfolio, a higher level of risk than perhaps what you intended to maintain initially. And that means rebalancing. That means that you have to bring the exposure back down to 70%. Monitoring is, I will never overemphasize this aspect. Monitoring your portfolio daily and track your progress. And finally, reviewing your portfolio on a regular basis, let's say at least once a year, or at the very least, if your personal circumstances were to change, or simply your objectives actually were to change, then you might want actually to revisit the portfolio to make sure that you reflect those changes into the construction of your portfolio. So I think that's quite a number of aspects that I touch upon. I hope that you actually find this presentation insightful. I will also say, as a closing argument, that always seek professional advice before making investment decisions, especially if you don't feel confident actually managing your portfolio on your own.